The aim of our institute, the Kaiser's Institute, which is a co-host of today's event, is to establish bridges of communication between the academia on the one hand and the community on the other, on issues of intelligence, national security, as well as international events such as the one that we're currently faced with in Ukraine. You can find out more about us at www.kisis.king.edu. One of the many things that we do at the Institute at King University is we publish the Security and Intelligence Studies Journal, a semi-annual publication which is the only undergraduate security and intelligence studies publication currently in the world. We publish a variety of issues on security and intelligence. Our first issue that came out last May was on the subject of national and international security threats. Our current issue that just came out this January focuses on Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's past, present, and future. Both issues you can find in the back of the room. They feature some of the best undergraduate scholarly research on security intelligence currently taking place in the United States. You can purchase individual issues for $5 each, or you can actually become a member of the Institute and get them straight to your door for $20 a year for community members and $10 if you are a student. It's a good day to be a student right now. The membership for the Institute includes access to special events, such of course as this one. In the past, we've hosted speakers such as Sam Faddis, a 22-year veteran of the CIA who retired in 2008 as the director of the CIA's WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction Counterterrorism Unit. Joyce Connery, director of Nuclear Energy Security at the National Security Council. And most recently, John Buchanan, a longtime CIA officer who retired in 2011 as director of the White House Situation Room. Now, as we meet here today, we're faced with what British Foreign Minister William Hague has called the most serious security crisis of our century. Ukraine, arguably one of the most strategically important countries in the world and home to around 50 million people, has been invaded by Russian troops who entered the country in response to a popular uprising that has toppled the former Ukrainian government and now has a new government in place. Many are asking right now whether what we're faced with is the prospect of a new Cold War. Additionally, the troubling events in Ukraine have reignited the broader discussion about Russian foreign policy in Eastern Europe in general. Now, Russia, as you know, has lost control of much of its sphere of influence following the implosion of the Soviet Union. Is it trying, or will it be able to reclaim it? Now, who better to address this critical question than this evening's guest speaker, Victor Ashe, America's longest-serving ambassador to Poland, a country which, just like Ukraine, is at the center of the geopolitical struggle being played out before our very eyes in Eastern Europe. Victor Ashe was elected at age 23 in 1968 to the Tennessee House of Representatives from Knoxville and served 6 years prior to being elected as state senator in 1975, where he served for 9 years. As a lawmaker, he sponsored Tennessee's presidential primary law, Scenic Routes Act, and Natural Areas Preservation Act. He was appointed executive director of the Americans Outdoors Commission in 1985, chaired by the then Governor Lamar Alexander. In 1987, he was elected mayor of Knoxville, where he became the longest-serving mayor in the city's history, serving 16 years. He pushed the expansion of the city parks and greenways, as well as putting the city finances on a sound foundation. He was elected president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the Tennessee Municipal League. In 2004, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to be ambassador to Poland, where he served 5 years, from June 2004 to October 2009. He was the longest-serving U.S. ambassador to the country in our history of diplomatic relations between America and Poland. In 2010, he was appointed by President Obama to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, on which he served for 3 years. This board oversees international broadcasting by the United States, including Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, and others. Mr. Ashe has been appointed by every president since Ronald Reagan to a board or position. It's a tremendous pleasure for us to be welcoming a speaker of such caliber at such a critical juncture for the security of our world. Please welcome Mr. Victor Ashe.
Thanks very much, Dr. Fitsanakis. It's a pleasure to be here. Is the mic working okay? Good. It's great to be here in Bristol, Virginia, by 100 feet. And it's good to see some old friends. Nancy DeFries, we're both appointed by Sullivan County State Senator, but the Speaker of the Senate, Ron Ramsey, to serve on the Douglas Henry State Museum Commission Board. And she's a very articulate advocate of the arts and the preservation of our history in Tennessee. And she's a very active member, and I can assure you Upper East Tennessee is well represented as well as the whole state level. It's also good to see a person I've known even longer, and that's Senator Carl Moore. And Carl's a Democrat and I'm a Republican, but we operate under the old Howard Baker theory that you can be an opponent without being an enemy. And the truth of the matter is, on many issues, we weren't opponents, we were allies. We agreed on a number of different things. But on those occasions when we differed, we could do it and still be friends at the end of the day. And that's one of those things that I think is missing, certainly in the U.S. Congress, and to some degree in the legislature today. But it's great to see and to be back among friends. When we first knew each other, you probably never thought he'd be listening to me 30 years later talking about Eastern Europe. That wasn't the topic. Tennessee doesn't have a foreign policy, and that wasn't the topic that we would be talking about in those days. When John Wilder, the longest serving speaker in the history of mankind, not just in Tennessee, I think forever, was the Speaker of the Senate in those days. I thought I would maybe talk 15, 20 minutes about my experience and my observations from having served for 5 years in Poland. It was certainly that was a country I never sought. I never sought to be an ambassador. President Bush, George W. asked me to do it, and people sometimes say, well, how did you get to be an ambassador? Well, my answer is, just to be blunt about it, it didn't hurt the fact that I went to college with the President of the United States. He at least knew my name later on in life, and he asked me to serve, and I was honored to do it. It was great to be in a country, Poland, where we're liked. That's not a long list of countries. But in this case, it's very true. In fact, we have no better ally in the world today, other than perhaps the United Kingdom, than the Republic of Poland. Poland's a country of some 40 million people. 10 million of our fellow American citizens are Polish Americans. So if you do the math, 1 out of every 4 Poles has an American cousin or uncle or brother or sister or somebody. Here in Chicago, Cleveland, or frankly at Tellico Village in East Tennessee, where there's actually a Polish American club in Tellico Village, a town that didn't exist 30 years ago, but is definitely a retirement community today in Loudoun and Monroe counties. If you sort of visualize the map of Europe, Poland obviously is in Eastern Europe. And its geographic location in the past was its great person life. I mean, to the west you had Germany, or Prussia. To the east you had Russia under the Tsars and then under Stalin. And to the south you had the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Poland's a very fertile, reasonably flat country, very agricultural producing. And as a result of their 2 more powerful neighbors on either side, going back to the 16th century, they were periodically invaded, occupied for 20, 30, 40 years, brutalized, divided, and mistreated. In fact, Poland, about the time our war for independence succeeded, ceased to exist as a nation because they were basically annexed into Prussia, Tsarist Russia, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. There was no nation called Poland from approximately 1780 till the end of World War I. Even though 2 Polish leaders came to help George Washington in our fight for independence. General Kosciuszko, who later became credited being the founder of West Point and a civil engineer, and General, we would say Pulaski in Giles County, Tennessee, but Pulaski if you're living in Poland. who actually died fighting for American independence in the Battle of Savannah. So those two Polish leaders gave much of their professional career, in one case his life, to American independence. There's a story to tell about which underlines, I think, the value that Poles have for liberty and freedom. But at the end of the war, and by today's standards, this would be considered horrible, what I'm about to say. The Continental Congress gave General Kosciuszko 5 slaves in thanks for his effort. As I say, today that would be considered reprehensible appropriately so. He immediately emancipated all 5 and gave them their freedom, which I think spoke volumes of his belief that liberty and freedom belong to all, regardless of race, color, or creed. And this was occurring in the 18th century, when slavery was still accepted as the norm by many so-called civilized people. But that same feeling of independence and liberty percolates through Polish society today. As I say, Poland achieved its independence at the end of World War I, not by the British Prime Minister or the French President pushing it, by an American president named Woodrow Wilson, who at that point in his life had never been outside the continental United States, but who went abroad to the Versailles Treaty negotiations, and he'd given his famous 14 points address to Congress, only 3.5 of which ever became reality. The rest are still studied by historians, but as concepts. But one of which was the reunification of Poland as an independent nation. Now you've got to ask yourself, Woodrow Wilson wasn't Polish. He'd never been to Poland or the former Poland. Why would he know or even care about reuniting Poland? Well, it turns out that one of his best personal friends was a man named Paderewski, a famous Polish musician and conductor, who lobbied him personally whenever they had a drink or got together to reunite his birthplace. So it does show that personal relationships can impact and make public policy. And the British and the French, of course, they really didn't care one way or another, but they agreed with Wilson's request. It didn't cost them anything. And the two countries that would have been most opposed to Poland's reunification in 1919 were in no position to do anything about it. Remember, the Kaiser's Germany had just lost the war. Russia had been taken over by the Bolsheviks. They had murdered the Tsar and his family in the basement of the house in the Urals. So they weren't welcomed in polite society. So as a result, Poland was reestablished, and we're about to celebrate in 2019 its 100th anniversary as a free and independent nation since the end of World War I. But during those, when I arrived as the 25th ambassador to Poland, American ambassador, it was diplomatic relations. And during those 90 years, Poland had only been free 40 of those years. From 1919 until 1939, when on September 1 with Hitler's invasion of Poland, followed on September 17 by Stalin's invasion of Poland. Remember, Stalin and Hitler at the start of World War II were allies, not opponents. And then they endured the Nazi occupation from September 1, 1939 until May the 10th of 1945, when the last battle of the European conflict of World War II was fought. And then Breslau, a German city, now Wrocław, a Polish city. Hitler had already committed suicide. The war was over, but Poland bore the full brunt of World War II from the day it started to the day it ended. There was no intermission. Remember, we didn't come into the war for 2 years, until December 7, 1941. Really 2.5 years, almost. And even Great Britain and France didn't start to feel the real impact of World War II until May of 1940, when France and the Netherlands and Belgium were invaded and Dunkirk occurred. In fact, it was referred to in February and March of 1940 as the phony war. Obviously it wasn't, but that was the impact of it. And then, of course, at the end of the war, Poland's occupied for the next 44 years by the communists. And the communists directed control of Poland. But Poland, which, of course, the communist was directed out of Moscow. Poland's relationship with Russia has always, on a good day, even today, would be suspicious. And from there it goes downhill. Now, the relation with Germany probably is not all that great, but it's more businesslike. I mean, Poles today do not blame today's German leaders for what Hitler did. They obviously condemn the Germans for the Holocaust and all the brutality that occurred in Poland. But it's not at the same level as their attitude towards Russians, which is almost genetic in terms of, and I think the Russian attitude towards Poland is, this is the way by which we've always been invaded. You can go back to Napoleon and the invasion of Russia and the Tsarist Russia came through, I mean, Napoleon marches from Paris through Germany, through Warsaw to Moscow. The same thing when Hitler breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Russia in 1940. He invades and goes all the way to St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, and to Moscow, and to Stalingrad. So you have that situation. I think and of course, up until the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1990, the Polish border to the east was the Soviet Union. All of it, north-south on the east. It's only when the Iron Curtain falls that instead of having the Soviet Union as your neighbor, you still have a small part of now Russia called Kaliningrad, which is a non-contiguous part of Russia. But then the next country south is Lithuania, then Belarus, then Ukraine, then Slovakia, then the Czech Republic. So it becomes a much more safer neighborhood, and you don't have one powerful neighbor of whom you are incredibly suspicious every day of the week as your immediate neighbor. And Ukraine, of course, is the largest neighbor. Ukraine is larger than Poland. But Ukraine is a manufactured country in some ways. While it was always part of the Soviet Union, if you remember, neither Stalin or Khrushchev were Russians. Stalin came from Georgia. Khrushchev came from Ukraine. Crimea, which has now been occupied by Russian troops, dressed as bandits, so they can claim it when the Russian military, wearing black masks and Lord knows what, is a peninsula connected by a narrow stretch of land into the Black Sea. It has a fascinating history. It's where the Charge of the Light Brigade occurred in British history with the war against Russia. It's where the conference at Yalta occurred. It's where the czars had their pleasure palaces and vacation homes. It has a very unusual history. And from a geographic standpoint, fairly distinguishable from the rest of the country. I mean, you can sort of get to it, occupy it, and not interfere with the rest, if that makes any sense. If you're Putin and trying to figure out the neat surgical dismemberment of Ukraine that you could make. You know, I think Putin knows we're not going to go to war. We're not going to send in troops. No one, either from the right or the left in American politics, has suggested that I don't think Americans have an appetite for another Afghanistan or another Iraq. So if that's off the table, the ability to respond is somewhat limited and very fluid. And what I suspect Putin is up to, well, first of all, he's up to no good. Secondly, he's up to reasserting as best he can the former power of the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, which is a reduced country. His fear and concern has always been that Georgia and Ukraine would ultimately join the EU and would join NATO, and he would have on his borders, particularly in NATO's case, countries that he would consider hostile. Now, the fact of the matter is, he already has 3 countries bordering Russia that are members of NATO. They are the 3 Baltic nations, which are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which are very small states, smaller than the state of Tennessee. They're about 1 million to 1.5 million each. In fact, the combined population of the 3 Baltic nations is less than the population of the state of Tennessee. But they are 3 sovereign independent nations. From a purely military standpoint, Putin could occupy them tomorrow with not a lot of difficulty. I think it'd be much more difficult for him to get away with it, and that might very well, under the NATO treaty, that would trigger military action. Because one of the articles, Article 7 of the NATO treaty, is that any nation under attack by a foreign power, all other members of NATO will come to their defense should that occur. That's how NATO got involved with us when we were attacked by Al-Qaeda in 9/11, was because we, a member of NATO, were under attack. But I think Putin's attitude is if he could take, he's already taken 2, when he invaded Georgia in 2008, he created 2 republics, both of which are about the size of Sullivan County. No offense to the good people of Sullivan County, don't mean it that way. But in terms of square miles, that's about the size of it is. It'd be as if Sullivan County became the new state of Sullivan or an independent nation. Or Blood County, or Greene County. I mean, it's about that size. And it's called South Ossetia. The only 4 countries in the world that even recognize it. North Korea, one of which, Belarus, which is controlled by Russia, and Russia. I forget what the 4th is. But I mean, no one takes it seriously as a nation. It's about as relevant as the state of Franklin would be, which was the free state of the state of Tennessee. I mean, interesting to read the history, but of no relevance in today's world. But they're, quote, and one of which is on the Black Sea, and it's only 40 miles away from Sochi, where the Winter Olympics just concluded. Which, when you think about it, was fairly brazen on Putin's part to host the Olympics at a location 40 miles from the scene of the most recent crime, if you consider invading the country and taking away its sovereignty and creating a phony state out of one province of that nation. So, and again, all of this was an important part of World War II, which has shaped the whole neighborhood. The whole neighborhood meaning Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Because by 1944, Stalin had repelled Hitler's invasion of Russia and was pushing the German troops back into Germany. People forget, even though Poland had gotten its independence in 1919, part of Poland, between the 2 wars and during World War II, was actually Prussia. East Prussia is only 100 miles up. The East Prussia that existed before World War II is only 100 miles north of Warsaw. It'd be like Knoxville is to Kingsport in terms of distance. That is where Hitler had the Wolfslager and where he directed World War II from the German side for the whole war. That's where the assassination attempt on Hitler in July of '44 occurred. It didn't occur in Berlin. It didn't occur in Nuremberg or Hamburg. It occurred at the Wolfslager, 100 miles north of Warsaw, which was still in German hands. But by that time, the Soviet army had advanced to the Wisła, which is the main river that goes through Warsaw, and was literally on the opposite side of the river. So Soviet troops were literally 100 miles from where Hitler was holed up and where the assassination of the bomb was exploded in the conference room that didn't get him, unfortunately. And it's an interesting place to go visit that. If you didn't know Hitler was a madman before you got there, you'd certainly know it after you saw it, in terms of bunkers and the things that he had set up for Himmler and Göring and himself and everything else. Most of the Holocaust and the Nazi death camps were located in Poland, because that's where the largest single portion of the European Jewish population was located. Poland at the start of World War II had 3.3 million Jews, Polish Jewish citizens. At the end of the war, 3 million had been murdered. The 300,000 remaining were not in Poland. They were scattered wherever they could flee or underground in the Polish resistance. On top of that, about 15% of the non-Jewish Polish population was murdered or died. So 20% of the Polish population perished in World War II. Even though Russia and Germany by numbers had more casualties, by percentage of the population it was far less than 20%, because they had a much larger population to start out with. But if you think about it, what if 20% of the population of Sullivan County disappeared tomorrow morning? Everyone in the county would be impacted. You'd know somebody or have a relative. And that puts it in perspective in terms of Poland and their attitude towards the Russians. And frankly, one reason Stalin was so insistent, sounds like I'm defending Stalin, I'm not, of in effect taking over and creating the government that he wanted to run Poland, was that he wanted to make sure there was no further entry into Russia from the West. And so it was Russian troops that, of course, got to Poland before the British, the French, or the Americans could get to Poland. Remember, Russian troops got to Berlin before we did. And that was one of the great disputes between Eisenhower and FDR, as long as he was living, Truman, Churchill, and everybody else. And while most Americans condemn the agreement from Yalta, and many will say that Poland was given away, the truth of the matter is Poland was already occupied by Russian troops by Yalta. And short of us going to war with our ally Russia in 1945 and continuing the World War, which America didn't have an appetite to do, there was no way to get them out. That only occurred 44 years later when the communist system, which is a bankrupt philosophical system and economically doesn't work, in addition to being immoral, it just doesn't work, fell and collapsed. I mean, ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union was as much economic as it was ideological. The system didn't work, and people wanted something better. I think Putin has figured he can't really eliminate Ukraine alone or convert it to a Soviet, or I should say Russian ally. So the next best thing from his standpoint is dismemberment or reduction of the whole. So you start off and you take Crimea. If he gets away with that, they're going to have a so-called referendum in 10 or 12 days. I think we all know the outcome of that. That'll be a 90-10 vote in favor of affiliating with Russia. Then the next question becomes, which American policy leaders have to look at, is, does Putin then immediately or just bides his time to go to the provinces of the main part of Ukraine that border Russia and in effect seek to annex them or have phony referendums or arrange for people to pretend to be Russians and take over the landscape of several significant provinces in eastern Ukraine, where a majority of the citizens are Russian speaking and do have long-time ties to Russia. That's not the case in western Ukraine. Again, if you go back to your World War II history, at the end of World War II, the map of Europe was rearranged, primarily by Stalin drawing new lines in the Kremlin. And basically what he did was he moved the Soviet Union boundary lines about 100 miles west. That is, Poland, western Ukraine, Lviv, and those major cities, and Lithuania were part of Poland. But when the war ends, Stalin simply moves the lines 100 miles west and makes that the boundary line of the Soviet Union, which, the so-called Republic of Belarus, the Republic of Ukraine, the Republic of Lithuania, but all part of the Soviet Union. And then to compensate Poland for its loss of land, it simply moves the boundary line of western Ukraine 100 miles into Germany. Now, no one had any sympathy for the Germans, and no one was going to, they just lost World War II. The Holocaust had been revealed. People were in a state of shock and outrage over what had occurred. And, nothing was too bad to hand to the Germans. So that wasn't hard to do. It would be as if North Carolina decided eastern Tennessee should be western North Carolina, and they just moved over to Crossville and made it west, and, you know, then we somehow moved from Mississippi to Little Rock and made eastern Arkansas western Tennessee. Well, I mean, we sit here and smile and laugh, I didn't know what happened. But, I mean, that, in effect, is what happened. And the people who got annexed, not only got annexed, they got moved out of town. I mean, when the Western Ukraine was annexed into the Soviet Union, the Poles were given 2 days to pack up. You could take 2 suitcases and leave. And the same thing happened to the Germans in Eastern Germany was, you can leave too. That's what you did to the Jews. The only difference is we're not gonna murder you. You just figure out a place to live on your own. It was not a nice time. Human rights were at a low level, but it's what happened. But people today, 70 years later, in Poland can tell you that story down to the name of the neighbor that got moved, or their uncle who got moved, or whoever it was. I mean, they all know it. So, you know, the situation is incredibly fluid. I don't know that there's an immediate answer. We know Russia and with the exception of the Yeltsin years, Russian leadership, whether under Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, or Putin, has been quite willing and prepared to send troops in to achieve their objectives. It could be in Prague, it could be the Budapest uprising from 1956 during the Eisenhower years. It can be as recently as 6 years ago in Georgia, and the day as recently as 2 weeks ago in Crimea. And what will it be 2 years from now? I don't know. I think you can count on Putin doing as much as he thinks he can get away with, and for which the price is not high. And that's the challenge, I think, to American leaders, whoever our president is, or Secretary of State, is determining what price can we impose upon them that will deter them from future activity. And I'm sure the President and Secretary Kerry are struggling with that. You can spend time saying they've done things in the past which encouraged Putin or didn't encourage him. You know, reviewing past history is interesting and helpful, but doesn't solve the situation you have. And so, you know, Putin, to be blunt about it, holds a lot of the cards on his side of the table. I don't enjoy saying that, but I mean, that's reality. Our challenge is to somehow convince him that continued occupation of Crimea over a period of time will be a price he really doesn't want to pay. And that's not an easy thing to prove. It's going to require a lot of patience. On the other hand, it's going to require a fair amount of gutsiness and willingness to, I would suggest, freeze bank accounts of oligarchs. You know, a lot of people don't realize America is the favorite playground of most Russian oligarchs. The property they own in Manhattan and Miami and other places is extensive. They're just as present as Chinese, I won't say oligarchs, billionaires. Denying them visas. That'll take a while to have an impact. And then will our European allies who are talking the talk, will they walk the walk? I mean, the truth is, Russia is not a major trading partner for the U.S. There are individual American companies like Pepsi that have major business activities in Russia, but by and large, Germany, France, UK are much bigger players. They're in the top 10 Russian trading partners. We're not even in the top 10. Now, in other countries, we'd be number one. So again, our resources to do things that would get his attention and cause him to think, maybe, is there a face-saving way out of this? Or limited? I don't have the answer. I'm just sort of outlining the issues. And I hope it's been helpful to you in a better understanding of what's going on there. It's a difficult part of the world. And you know, Crimea itself is not a critical military value. I mean, admittedly, the Russian Navy's there, but it's in the Black Sea. The Black Sea doesn't connect to anything except the Mediterranean, and you go through an isthmus through Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, which is, you know, less than a mile wide and 17 miles long. There's no other way to get your ships out. except my language. You know, I mean, so the Black Sea is important for the 6 countries, Bulgaria, Georgia, Turkey, that border it. But in terms of being important to the world, such as the Mediterranean or the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Adriatic or the Indian Ocean, it's just not in that ballpark. I mean, it's kind of not, it's down the list. That's why Russia's really never been a major naval power except through the Baltic. But, you know, the Baltic, you know, back before we had climate change, got frozen up in the winter. And so it's just a different situation. With that, thanks for inviting me. I'd be glad, I may have talked longer than I should have, but it's a fascinating subject. I'd be glad to answer any questions or respond to comments or whatever you may have. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about Edward Snowden and your thoughts on it.
Right. What about it?
Well, yeah, there he is in Russia, but he's in Russia, but he did some service to the world with his expose of.
You said he did service or
To
just?
me, I feel he did.
All right.
So, what is your thought about what would happen to him in all this situation?
Well, I mean, in all fairness, I need to start out with you, Judge, you and I differ on
Oh,
whether he
yes.
did a service. I think he did a service. But, you know, that's a fair topic of discussion. The fact is, and the WikiLeaks probably were started on this, but, you know, if embassies cannot have confidential cables back to the home office, meaning the State Department, the President, then your ability to do what embassies do becomes useless. It's not good. You know, what Snowden did, well, it's interesting. If he's an advocate of freedom, he's being given refuge by a country that is not an advocate of freedom, and for which individual human rights is severely curtailed. If he were a Russian citizen and had done that to the Russian government, he wouldn't be walking the streets of Moscow. He'd be in some gulag in Siberia. But that's a distraction. You know, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if Snowden ever decides to return to the U.S., he'll face the legal action, and he should. I understand you would disagree, but I mean, I don't think he should return to the U.S. anytime soon. And I don't think if some agreement is reached on Crimea, Snowden, in my mind, will probably not be part of it. And I can't imagine, given what President Obama, Attorney General Holder said about Snowden, there's no way they're going to cut a deal to let him off. And I don't see a future American president, be it Democratic or Republican, who would change that policy. I mean, they could, you know. The president has the right to pardon anyone, he can do it, but I don't see that happening. And you don't have to be in the U.S. to accept the pardon. But I can't imagine that. Yes, sir.
Russia has used its energy exports, namely natural gas, as a diplomatic tool in its dealings with Ukraine.
I just had trouble hearing.
Russia has used its energy exports, particularly natural gas, as a diplomatic tool in its relations with Ukraine. Does it do the same with Poland?
Well, energy is certainly important. I mean, you know, Russia's a source of energy for Eastern Europe through Gazprom. And of course, Putin has control of Gazprom to a way that our president doesn't control ExxonMobil or American gas or energy companies, I mean, except through governmental regulations. I mean, President Obama can't call up the director to do something, whereas Putin certainly has that authority. And Putin can, in effect, set the price of energy that comes from Russia to a lot part to Eastern Europe. The alternative source that is starting to come, and it's a question of where the pipeline goes, is from Azerbaijan. Does it go through Georgia and Ukraine, which are, at least part of which today are independent of Russia, and reach Eastern European countries? You know, to the degree fracking occurs in Eastern Europe, and there is an effort in Poland to augment that, that will reduce Eastern European dependence on Russia. You know, for any sovereign nation to be dependent on another nation for 80 to 90% of its energy supply, no matter who that nation is really rolling the dice. I mean, if relations go south with that nation, they have an incredibly convenient weapon, choke on you. And Putin has shown with his relations with Ukraine and with Belarus that he's quite prepared to use it. That's why President Bush thought it was such a mistake by Chancellor Schroeder who signed the deal for Russian gas with Germany. And I think Chancellor Merkel would probably agree with former President Bush today on that. I mean, and I don't mean that to be partisan or ideological. I'm just saying it's a mistake to have predominantly one source for something you cannot do without, unless you have control of that source. And what do you do if they cut off the gas in January? It gets pretty cold real fast. And that is, you know, or you don't have water, whatever it is. I mean, you think of the things you can't live without, of which the ability to have heat would be one of them. Yeah, yes, sir.
Considering Putin's attempts to create a Eurasian Union.
Wait, what?
Considering Putin's attempts to create a Eurasian Union, how much do you believe Russia's efforts in Ukraine are about obtaining the foreign policy goal of maintaining or obtaining a greater power status?
Oh, I think it's very much aimed at that. I mean, you know, the counterbalance that he has to the EU is this Eurasia economic link. Well, I mean, it's really made up of Russia, Belarus, south of Sketchia. I mean, it's nothing. I mean, in terms of economic, it's Russia versus the EU, which is, you know, 20 some odd European nations. You know, I mean, no one in their right mind is particularly interested in joining that group. I mean, it doesn't bring you anything, assuming you agree with it. You know,
I'd like to point out that Kazakhstan has agreed to.
well, Kazakhstan, okay. Well, that would add more. You know, there are a few of the former, I'm not sure about Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan or those, but, and Kyrgyzstan has some energy resources. But again, if that's your base, if that's your nucleus, and that's it, it's a pretty weak group compared to all of Western Europe and a lot of the former Eastern European republics, such as Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, and those groups. But, you know, I mean, that's why Putin offered Yanukovych, former president of Ukraine, some $15 billion in aid to basically deter him from joining the EU. In other words, give him a better package. Well, you know, the $15 million was a better package, but what you were joining wasn't a better package. You know, I mean, it's a short-term win and a long-term loss. I mean, that's the point. Plus, it flew in the face of what a majority of Ukrainians wanted. I mean, the majority of Ukrainians want to be more affiliated with the West than with the East. Because they're the next door neighbor to Poland, and Poland and Ukraine were in a similar situation 30 or 40 years ago when they were under communist domination. But since the fall of the Iron Curtain, they've observed for the last 24 years Poland's advent into democracy, a free government, which governments can be voted in or out. The losers aren't shot or assassinated the next week or put in jail. In fact, the losers come back and win the following election, kind of like Republicans and Democrats do here in the U.S. I mean, it's kind of how the system works. And in terms of economic benefits, Poland is a flourishing economic success. Even in 08 and 09, when the U.S. was suffering a 4 and 5% decrease, Western Europe was the same. Poland was enjoying a 1% increase. I mean, President Obama would have given his right arm to have a 1% increase back in 2009 and 10 and 11. So they stand as a next door example of economic success. So what? Wouldn't you want to be part of the success as opposed to part of the failure? I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. And it's right there for them all to see. And I made 3 visits to Ukraine when I was ambassador to Poland, to Lviv, to Odessa, and to Kiev. And, you know, it was very obvious Ukraine was 15 to 20 years behind Poland in terms of economic situation. I mean, you went to one-lane roads that they drove on like they were two-lane roads. You know, where you push the car to the other side. Yes, ma'am.
I was in Eastern Europe a few
What?
years. I was in Eastern Europe a few years ago on vacation, and Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, all those countries were working diligently to get into the European Union. Have any of them made it in?
They're all in it now.
They're all in there.
Everyone,
in there.
not all of the former Yugoslav republics, but most of them are.
Okay.
Kosovo's not in it yet, and Serbia's not, but they're close to it. Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia are part of it, and certainly Romania is, Bulgaria is. And they're all working that way. I mean, the southern Eastern European countries are a little further behind than the northern ones. Northern meaning Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and the three Baltic nations. They're as western as France or Germany today. Whereas Romania is probably getting closer to that, to being western, but isn't quite there. And, but you know, you got to know the history. I mean, they were, you know, during communist times, the southern Europeans, with the exception of Yugoslavia, were more true believers in the communist philosophy. I mean, Albania was truly a Stalinist state. Romania was controlled by the, I forget the name, Nicholas, anyway, there was a shop one evening. But they sort of ran a fiefdom. Poland was always different from the rest of the country. In fact, Russia always distrusted it. It was sort of like Tea Party Republicans would view modern Republicans as not real Republicans. And, you know, Moscow always looked upon Poland, well, when the U.S. invades, will the Polish army defend Mother Russia? Well, actually, it's a good question. The answer is no, they wouldn't. Because deep down, the Poles were counterfeit communists. And two differences you had in Poland, which didn't exist in other countries, was you always had some private property ownership. In a pure communist country, the state owns everything. But small family farms, 6, 8, 10 acres, stayed in private hands. The second factor, which was more significant even than that, was the church, and in Poland, it's the Catholic Church. But, you know, communist philosophy obviously is atheist. I mean, there is no opium, religion's the opium of the masses. But in Poland, you could go to church on Sunday, go to Mass, and not be interrogated on Monday by the secret police. And of course, that's the country where Karol Wojtyla, John Paul II came from. And the church and state within Poland, there is no separation of church and state in Poland, unlike the United States. I remember one time when I went around the country, you always visit the mayor and the governor, and I'd always visit the bishop, which of course was the Catholic bishop. It's 97% Catholic, and people go to church on Sunday. I remember asking the bishop one time, I said, well, you know, I come from Knoxville, Tennessee, there's an active Catholic church, and there we have a parochial school system, and good Catholics send their children to the parochial school system. Why is it Poland doesn't have a parochial school system? He smiles and says, we don't need it. Catechism is taught in school. Well, that doesn't happen here in the U.S. I mean, if you want a religious education, you send your child on their own to a church-affiliated school. They don't have discrimination. I mean, we had plenty of Mormons who came to Poland and proselytized, knocked on doors, and presented their views, and I think they were politely received and politely turned down. But they weren't discriminated against or locked up because that's what they did. So, you know, it's just a different religious culture and view of church and state than what we have. And it will change anytime soon. And frankly, during communist times, the church was the opposition. I mean, that was the institution. And I remember, you know, people told me that when John Paul became a pope, he made his first pilgrimage back to Poland. And of course, remember, he's the first non-Italian pope in 450 years. First Polish pope ever. And it's a country that's 95% Catholic. So the country was, you know, just beside itself with joy and celebration. And there's a famous story that Brezhnev called us, Jaruzelski, the Secretary General of the Polish Communist Party, after he was elected by the College of Cardinals and said, how could you let this happen? As if the Secretary General of the Communist Party had any control over what Cardinals do when they meet in Rome. And, but anyway, he comes back 9 months later as the Pope. And, you know, the government of the day probably wanted him like you want a root canal. But they couldn't block it. I mean, you couldn't. And when he landed at the Warsaw airport, of course, he gets off the plane, he kneels and kisses the ground. They had not put the itinerary out in the media. But of course, people at church had been told by the priest all over Poland what his itinerary was. And the Warsaw airport is about the distance of the Tri-City airport would be to Bristol, within 15, 16 miles roughly. So the 15 or 16 miles into Warsaw, it was 20 deep on both sides of the road as the Pope-mobile went into town. And then he arrives at the main square, and they have a mass of almost 2 million Poles. And Poland had never had a crowd of 2 million people in its entire history, either in battle or in peace or in celebration or whatever. Hadn't happened. And as Poles told me, the government of the day, when they looked out the windows and saw 2 million people gathered and listening to the Pope and taking communion, you know, the lights went off. They're not there for us. They're there for the Pope. And the Pope's message was clearly calibrated to provide hope and inspiration without inciting revolution. So he said things like, let Poland be Poland. God stands with you. I have not forgotten. Code words that anybody could figure out what he was saying. And, you know, the world was watching. I mean, you know, pretty clear. I mean, if he had said, storm the party headquarters, they'd have done it. But, you know, you've got to give him credit. In 10 years from his first visit, or 11 years, by peaceful means and by referendum, the government of the day had fallen and a free democratic government was elected. And, you know, he kept faith with his religion and kept faith with change that he played a large role in making happen. And, you know, Ukraine, of course, is not Catholic, it's Ukrainian Orthodox, just as there's Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Bulgarian Orthodox, various phases, types of Orthodox Christianity. But it's interesting how Putin, I mean, here's Russian atheist society, with the fall of communism, has reestablished the Russian Orthodox Church. And Putin has become the Russian Orthodox Church's big friend, patron. He has discovered religion. And you draw your own conclusions as how sincere it might be. I'll leave that to. But having the church with him in today's Russia and putting priests with Russian troops is very convenient and very good optics from what he wants to do. From our standpoint, we'd say clever and diabolical, but that is what he's doing. Yeah.
Going back to Ukraine, you know, it's interesting how the Ukrainian situation brings out what we call in political science the nationalist paradox, which is that country B wants to become independent from country A and succeeds. But then country C, or nation C, wants to become independent from nation B. And nation B gets really upset about this. So for instance, you know, Ukraine wanted to become independent from Russia, they succeeded it. Now Crimea wants to become independent from Ukraine, Ukrainians are very upset. What's the logical reason to deny Crimea, what Ukraine succeeded?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could follow the example of Yugoslavia and become 7 nations. That's what happened there. 6 originally, and then Kosovo separates from Serbia, so now it's 7. You know, we fought a civil war over whether or not states could, on their own, vote to do something different. Answer is no. You know, on that basis, the Virgin Islands, they'll vote, they're the new nation of the Virgin Islands. Maybe so, maybe not. Certainly one of the 50 states could not do that. I mean, our Constitution is very clear about that. No matter, you know, I think there were 6 counties just a year ago in northern Colorado that are unhappy with the state government in Denver that voted. I think 3 counties in favor, and 3 against, but a majority in favor of leaving Colorado and forming some new state. You know, interesting topic, but it's not going to happen. You know, I think it gets back to your view of nations. I mean, we have approximately 180 nations in the world today. Are we going to go to 280? I mean, every neighborhood that has a different point of view. You know, West Knoxville thinks differently than North Knoxville. They don't have the right to leave the city, have the right to vote out the mayor. But that's democracy. If you don't like your state legislator, you can vote them out. But you can't vote yourself out of where you live. And I think that's fairly central. I mean, you know, these nations belong to the United Nations. I'm not aware of a process that permits every province or every county within a given nation to determine one day that they'll be the newest 181st nation of the world. And what sort of chaos does that lead? At some point you say enough's enough. And, you know, we're gonna have to live with what we got and make it work.
Do you have time for maybe one more question, one last question you might?
I've kept you all longer than you may want to be. Yes, sir.
So, I'm not defending here, but we can sit here and speculate about his motives. But what he claims that he's doing is that he's basically protecting ethnic Russians, even though there's no evidence that anybody was trying to harm the ethnic Russians there. There have been suggestions that they send monitors in there to make sure that everybody's taken care of from the international community. If Putin agrees to this, would it not say, I mean, could we then not say, okay, then his motives aren't to take over Ukraine, but...
Well, I have major reservations. Remember that was Hitler's argument when he took over the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. He was protecting ethnic Germans who lived in Sudetenland. And that's when Chamberlain feuded Munich and came back to the agreement, peace in our time, that lasted 8 months. Or when he took over Austria and annexed it into Germany. There were German Austrians that he was, quote, protecting. I don't buy that argument at all. There's a substantial minority, 20% of Tartars, which are Muslim people, in Crimea. I admit that we're a predominantly Christian nation, not entirely, but predominantly. And these are people who Stalin sent to Kazakhstan during the 30s. Half of them died on the way that they got there, and another half probably died while they were there. They're with Yeltsin and the change, they moved back. They're adamantly opposed to going back into Russia. Are their rights? Do we divide Crimea up into the Tartar Crimea versus the Russian Crimea? So we have 2 Crimeas? You know, it's like when Pakistan left India. I mean, the Muslims went one way, the Hindus went another. And thousands of people were died and were murdered in the process. And Pakistan and India still are friends, 70 years later. So, I mean, you know, you can't go through neighborhoods and say, we'll take the Muslim houses and leave the Christians or the Hindus and we'll leave the Buddhists. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. We're fortunate to live in a society where we respect people's religions and don't get uptight over the fact that someone's Jewish or Presbyterian or Buddhist or Hindu. I live on a street that has 2 synagogues, and I have every type of Protestant denomination from Seventh-day Adventists to Unitarians to Christian Scientists to Baptists. So I've got the whole, and everybody's happy. I mean, you know, nobody thinks a thing about it. I mean, there are places of worship, and you do your thing, and we respect people. That culture obviously doesn't exist in other parts of the world. But I think that's something we have to offer to people in the sense of, because you're a different religious background, you don't have to hate and want to murder the person of a different faith. Or maybe someone who has no faith, who's atheist.